The idea of other vampires sent a chilling thrill through Vlad's veins. It was both terrifying and undeniably exciting. And the journal gave Vlad all the proof he needed to believe his parents had been murdered. A low, muffled sound that might have been shouting reached Vlad's ear. He turned his head toward the parking lot of the junior high school 2 blocks over. 2 men were arguing loudly. Vlad tucked the journal in his inside jacket pocket and floated down to a nearby oak. Willing his body forward, he bounced gingerly from tree to tree until he stood in the crook of another large oak tree, over the heads of the 2 arguing men. Mr. Otis opened the door to his car. His usual smile had been replaced with a sneer. He dropped his bag in the front seat and turned back to the man dressed in black. "This conversation is over." "Don't speak to me like I'm one of your students, Otis." The man slanted his dark eyes. His words were fog in the cool air. "Where is Thomas?" Vlad raised a perplexed eyebrow. The man couldn't possibly mean his dad. Walking carefully out onto a branch, Vlad perched on the limb and listened. "I can't provide you with information I don't have." Otis looked at the ground at his feet and lowered his voice so that Vlad had to strain to hear him. "The boy will lead me to him. Give him time." The man in black stepped forward, his body suddenly stiff, anxious. "You've located the Provost?" Otis met the man's eyes with a stubborn glance. "I've been in contact with Vladimir, yes." Vlad leaned so far forward at the mention of his name that he had to steady himself with his hand on another branch, or he'd have fallen on Mr. Otis's head. Now that would have been an awkward moment. After a moment of silence, the man placed his arm on the roof of Otis's car and drummed his fingers with a decided lack of patience. "Why are you hiding your thoughts from me, Otis, and why haven't I been able to read the minds of the townspeople? You found a connection to Thomas after the council has searched for him for 14 long years, and you haven't informed anyone? Why? What are you up to?" Otis glanced up at the branch that Vlad was perched on. Vlad held his breath. He couldn't possibly be seen from this distance, especially not with the cover of darkness. Yet Vlad swore he could feel Otis's eyes on him. After a nerve-wrackingly long moment, Otis returned his attention to the man in front of him, but he didn't speak. The man grabbed Otis by the collar and hissed, "If you gave those people the Tigo charm to block my telepathy—" Otis laughed, but his posture suggested he was ready to defend himself if need be. "You worry too much. I'm on your side. Remember, I want to find Thomas just as much as you do." The man relaxed his grip on Otis's collar and took a step back. "Then explain to me what's going on here." Otis smiled, his eyes chastising. "Have you considered that Thomas may have given the Tigo charm to any number of Bathory citizens? He is trying to elude us, after all." The man searched Otis's eyes and nodded. "I suppose it's possible." A tingling sensation had begun at Vlad's toes and was spreading upward. His foot had fallen asleep. He sat, allowing his numb foot time to stop tingling. The branch creaked softly beneath him. The man's eyes darted to the tree Vlad was sitting in. Once again, Vlad didn't breathe. "Did you hear something?" Otis placed a hand on the man's shoulder and directed him back to the sidewalk. "Being away from Elysia is making you paranoid, Diablo. Go home. Get some rest. When I locate Thomas, I'll contact you." After Diablo had disappeared down the street, Otis turned and walked back to the tree. He looked up at the branch of the large oak, his eyes searching. From the bushes near the sidewalk, Vlad breathed a very tense, very quiet sigh of relief. 11. Mr. Otis Comes to Dinner. Vampires drink blood, sleep in coffins, and fear garlic. Mr. Otis stood in front of the class, dressed in a black suit and a cheap vinyl cape, not so different from the one Vlad had worn on Halloween. Leaning against the desk, he looked at Vlad with a curious glint in his eye, and smiled before turning toward the chalkboard where he'd taped various artists' interpretations of vampires over the centuries. Vlad paid special attention to the Hungarian Countess and the Transylvanian Prince. Were they real vampires too? Relatives of his? Mr. Otis turned back to the class and stared at him intently. Vlad shifted in his seat. Several of his classmates looked from their teacher to Vlad. Mr. Otis blinked, awakening from whatever dreamland had occupied his mind for a minute. "Vlad, I want you to help me with something before you give your oral presentation." His hand disappeared into one of the desk drawers, and he retrieved a plastic container, its lid tightly sealed. He held it out. With a quick glance at Meredith, Vlad left his seat for the front of the class. He took the container and looked expectantly at his teacher. Mr. Otis seemed to be holding his breath, but then he spoke, his voice a low, almost growling whisper. "Please pass the garlic cloves out to the rest of the class, Vladimir." Vlad looked at the container in his hands. All that stood between him and one of the deadliest herbs known to vampire kind was 1/8 of an inch of mustard-yellow plastic. "I can't." He held the container out to Mr. Otis, who tilted his head and crossed his arms stubbornly in front of him. "Why not?" Mr. Otis, arms crossed, was tapping one finger against his biceps and watching the container in Vlad's hand with seeming indifference. Vlad set the container on Mr. Otis's desk. "I'm allergic to garlic. If you don't believe me, check with the office. They have it on file." He shrugged, ignoring the scoffs of some of his classmates. Mr. Otis paused for a moment, then returned the container to his desk drawer and glanced up at the clock before turning back to Vlad. "All right, then. Let's carry on with your oral presentation on what it's like to be a vampire." He raised his eyebrow. There had been no question in his tone, no suggestion of what it must be like. Mr. Otis had omitted those things because there was no question in his mind. He knew Vlad's secret. Vlad's legs felt like jelly. His insides had cooled to the point that it seemed his vocal cords were frozen and unable to make a mere utterance. Vlad focused on pushing into Mr. Otis's thoughts. A blurry image began to form at the forefront of his mind. It was red like blood. The feeling that accompanied it was fear. Mr. Otis's crisp voice shook Vlad from his trance. "Vlad, please continue with your presentation." Vlad cleared his throat and slowly turned to face the rest of the class. He looked back at his empty desk and wished that he was there before clearing his throat needlessly again. "My name is Vladimir Todd, and I'm a vampire." His ears suddenly felt very warm. He glanced at Mr. Otis, who gestured for him to continue. Vlad's mind went blank. He couldn't remember what he'd previously written on the subject. Mr. Otis looked irritated. The rest of the class shifted listlessly. Vlad decided to wing it. "It's not easy being a blood-sucking creature of the night. If I go out without my sunblock, I'll likely burst into flames." Meredith chuckled. She wasn't alone. Suddenly Vlad didn't feel quite so mortified. "Aside from characters in books and stories that I can't prove to be true, I'm pretty sure I'm the only vampire left. It's kind of lonely, but at least I don't have to wait in long lines at the blood bank." Vlad smiled. To his immense surprise, he was enjoying this. "If I concentrate, I can make my body float, and sometimes I can read people's thoughts. But for the most part, being a vampire bites." The class erupted in applause. Even Mr. Otis gave a smile. Vlad turned back to his seat, and as he walked away, he threw Mr. Otis another glance. His teacher reached for his coffee cup, his sleeve pulling up enough to reveal the hint of a tattoo on the inside of his wrist. The ink was thick and black. Vlad gasped aloud. It looked a lot like the symbol that had been carved into Mr. Craig's porch, the one that had been haunting him for months. The only difference was that the lines were slanting in the opposite direction. The bell rang its shrill tone, pronouncing school officially over. Vlad gathered his books and bolted from the classroom without so much as a glance at Mr. Otis. Henry was waiting on the steps outside. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, and one of his thumbs was threaded through a belt loop on his jeans. He smiled at Vlad, but his smile quickly melted as Vlad moved closer. "What's wrong? You look pale." Though he normally laughed at Henry's puns, Vlad ignored the quip and grabbed a handful of Henry's shirt. "I think Mr. Otis killed my parents." Henry gaped at him.